Let me take you to ancient Greece, 2,500 years ago. Imagine a formation of soldiers on the verge of battle, wearing forged armor and helmets, and tightly holding on to their spears and shields. When they hear the command, they sprint, charging towards their ruthless enemies, and believing with full conviction that they will come out victorious. Later that day, their commanders and other men of status in long togas gather together and celebrate on reclining furniture. They are fed grapes, they drink wine, and they're entertained by women and young boys while discussing philosophy and democracy into the dusk. I doubt what I've just described was difficult for anyone to conjure up, because these are some of the most repeated scenes from our collective perception of the ancient world. You may have been reminded of childhood characters, movies, books, or memorable field trips to the museum where you got to see the armor and the vessels that these Grecians were using. And these images in your head are more than just a visualization of a remote past. They're also the beginning of a cultural narrative that still defines what it means to belong to the West. Now, if I were to mention the names of some other peoples living at the same time and within the same world as these Grecians, such as the Thracian peoples, the Lydians, the Dacians, or the Scythians, I doubt you will have ever heard of them, let alone consider them part of your cultural lineage. Now, why is that? And why does it matter thousands of years later? Well, personally, I got into ancient history because I was determined to find a hack into the West. I'm from Iran, and I grew up in the United Arab Emirates. And when I was younger, I had this naive belief that if I became an expert in ancient Greco-Roman history, aka the cradle of Western civilization, I will sincerely gain an insight into what made the West so commanding and successful for such a long period of time. And in that process, I'd learn about my place in the world. Well, I'm happy to say that I did get there eventually, just not in the way I was expecting. Because the kinds of questions that came naturally to me in my studies led my professor to pull me to the side one day and say, "Saba, you are not interested in history, you are interested in historiography." And that changed how I looked at everything. So historiography is a field that examines the act of writing history itself. It looks at the larger context that a history was written in and asks questions like, who was the historian? What was their position in and view of their world? What access to historical materials did they have? And how did the narratives they write affect society, both then and now? And what looking through this lens revealed me is how we came to our collective perception of the ancient world. This occurred relatively recently, through the 19th and 20th centuries, at a time when Europe was in an exciting period of modernizing and nation building, all while enjoying the height of colonial imperialism. The early archaeologists and historians were more like amateur adventurers, and what they had access to was very sparse factual information of the ancient world. That led much of their process to be about filling in the blanks. Not surprisingly, over time, those blanks got filled in with the ideologies of the era. And that included a rather binary perspective that celebrated notions like democracy over despotism, rationality over savagery, man over nature, and the West over the East. Now, I wish I could tell you that coming into the 21st century, we were able to leave these binary constructs behind. But the truth is that they have become deeply embedded in how we tell the story of our origins, from inside our museums to our education systems, and from there to our popular culture. Now, there was one moment in my research that really crystallized this notion for me, where I saw both the problem exposed and also a potential solution out of that problem at the same time. And I'd love to tell you the story of the two ancient spoons that brought me there. One day, back in 2011, this beautiful 2,500-year-old spoon went up for sale at a Christie's auction house in London. I saw it through the catalog entry that had the label, Lot 340, and Achaemenid silver kaiathos. It's a mouthful. So kaiathos is an ancient term for something like a ladle, so we'll call it a spoon. And Achaemenid is a reference to the first Persian Empire. Now, there was nothing particular about the spoon at first, until my eyes wandered to the auctioneer's notes. They mentioned the existence of another virtually identical spoon that was owned by the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. The only difference with this spoon was that it was labeled as being Greek. So that perked my interest. Here we had two virtually identical spoons and two very established authorities slotting them into opposing origins. Did they belong to the Greek tradition, or were they a part of their enemy's heritage, the Persians? Now, it isn't that uncommon for experts to disagree. After all, the farther back we go, the blurrier things get. But I decided to keep looking into it anyway, and I'm glad I did, because by the end of it, I had a completely different understanding of what I was looking at. I discovered that back in the 80s in New York, the Metropolitan Museum of Art was battling a lawsuit that had a group of over 300 artifacts, including the twin spoon, at the center of it. The lawsuit was brought against them by the Turkish government. You see, Turkey was accusing the Met of knowingly buying looted artifacts that had been smuggled out of their country and then misrepresenting them as being Greek to cover up the fact. They had evidence to prove that these artifacts came from the burial mounds of a people who lived a long time ago in Western Anatolia, and more importantly, who did not identify as being either Greek or Persian. We know these people today as the Lydians. Thousands of years ago, the Lydians were a people who lived on land that was rich with gold deposits, and this brought them attention. They first enjoyed a few centuries of their own statehood, growing into this rich and proud culture that had plenty of interaction with their neighbors to either side. And then one day, they were attacked, conquered, and colonized by the Persian Empire to their east, and a few centuries later, by Alexander the Great, that came charging from the west. Now, each time that the Lydians were taken over, we can assume that their way of life changed permanently, and there was a transfer of people, power, and culture. But with that said, throughout all this time, the Lydians are known to have remained both ethnically, and many also argue through language, distinguishable from their neighbors to either side. In the ancient world, they were widely attributed with the invention of coin minting, so we can thank currency in our modern world to them. And you may have also heard the fable of King Midas with the golden touch that warns of the dangers of having too many riches. Well, it also originated from that region long ago. But unfortunately for the Lydians today, they just don't have a place in our collective perception of the ancient world because they confuse the binary narrative. It took Turkey 6 years to win that lawsuit against the Met and bring that group of artifacts, including the twin spoon, back home. But it never changed the bigger picture, because over 20 years later, the spoon that I had first noticed in the auction catalog ended up having a really successful sale, with the same inaccurate label of being Persian and having a Greek twin. The truth is that we will never be able to pinpoint who made these spoons. But it just as easily could have been, let's say, a Lydian artisan, having been trained in the popular Persian arts, making work for and to the tastes of certain Grecian aristocrats that had been living in Lydia for generations. With what we know today, there is probably more accuracy in that attribution than what the museum or auction house put forward. But a hard truth that I've had to accept about our present is that the more complex a world seems to become, the more tightly we hold on to a black and white understanding of it, whether that's about today or thousands of years ago. And nowadays, as we continue to advance our archaeological tools and 3D digitize our artifacts into complex collections online for a future metaverse, well, we might feel like we're moving forward, and in some ways we are, but we also just keep moving further away from what history essentially is: collective storytelling. And I cannot stress enough how important the start of a story is, because it sets the stage for the rest of the events to unfold in. If we instead revisit the ancient world and refill those blanks with a new frame of mind, not in order to tell epic tales of grand divisions and good over bad, but to tell stories of syncretism. That's a term that means the layering of different people and cultures to continuously transform us into something new. Well, then maybe in a generation or two, we'll have been able to unravel some of the worst prejudices sewn into our collective identity, those that affect how we feel around foreign and unfamiliar people. It's been a long time since I stopped trying to find my place in the world by fitting into an established narrative. My experience with the Lydian spoons helped me see myself for what I am: a culturally syncretic person that often confuses the categories. I'm a proud Iranian raised in the UAE through a mixed bag of Arab, Persian, British, and Indian cultures. Moreover, today I have Canadian citizenship, but I've made my home here in the Netherlands with my Italian partner. It hasn't been the easiest ride, but I know that I am not one in a million, by far. My generation, our generation, and the next ones are the most culturally syncretic people to have ever existed. So it seems simple to me. I ask our institutions, and I ask you, shouldn't that be the perspective from which we revisit and retell the story of us? Think about it. Thank you.